it's in. Not very good at that, but this is fun because continuing to talk about Hegel. I remember in college, I might have already said that when I first went to college, I had been a Roman Catholic, and I never really put much thought into any of that stuff. It was all the priests would just teach us, or the nuns would just teach us, and okay, that's the way it is. Get to college, and of course in philosophy class, the philosophy professor starts off with that question about God, that you're like, what? And your head starts to sweat. And it's like your whole world is just torn apart. Your conceptual world, which you don't think of it as being significant, but there's a great, lots of folks, but I especially remember Isaiah Berlin talking about, what philosophy does. And he talks about how it studies the conceptual schemas that basically give us our view of life, that your Weltanschauung, your worldview, right? And so when you're in a philosophy class and you're asking questions about all that stuff, they're very annoying, because unlike, this is a bottle of water, 2 + 2 = 4, is this a good bottle of water? Well, I don't know. Some of us will say yes, others will say no, right? There's no real answer. What is good? We don't really have an answer to that. We could argue like crazy over it. What is morality? Is there a moral law? You can get into all of that stuff, and certainly over history, it's evolved and changed, and people used to think a certain thing, like astronomy, for example. They used to think that the stars and planets all traveled in perfect circles because they thought circles were perfect and everything up there was close to heaven, so it ought to be perfect, right? It's actually not an empirical truth that circles are perfect, nor is it a kind of a systematic truth that circles are perfect. It's not, there's no mathematical axiom that says circles are the perfect shape. You don't have that. So where did it come from? It was, a metaphysical belief that no one really had the grounds for, but people all believed it. And so all of a sudden discovering that stars didn't move in circles, or that the planets don't go in circles, perfect circles, etc. Right? It was a shock to people. But at the same time, it moved from a metaphysical question to an empirical question. Because now you could use telescopes to see where things were and measure them and so on. So in a sense, a lot of things that had been metaphysical questions became empirical questions. So science kind of did away with a lot of things. The God of the gaps, so to speak, right? It used to be that people didn't know why such and such happened. God did it, right? Well, then they figured out the science of why it happened, and God didn't have to do that, And so God's responsibilities got less and less and less, etc. Right? Those kind of metaphysical beliefs that give you your worldview. Wow, that's totally invisible to you when you're a kid growing up. You don't realize it's there. You just think that's the way the world is. But boy, you get to philosophy class and those questions start coming out of nowhere. Can't answer them. They're annoying as heck. But at the same time, it seems quite liberating to be aware of just how trapped in a worldview you were. But at the same time, being freed from that worldview frees you also from your values. Because the values that you have, the goals that you set, etc., were all embedded in that worldview. So question that worldview, and all of a sudden now you end up with a very depressing situation, because now you don't know why you're here. The role I had, grow up, be a father, get a job, maybe in insurance or something, right? Who knows? Some boring thing, but who cares? It's just that you got to go to church every Sunday, raise your family, make sure they all go to school. It's right. That's it. Well, all of a sudden, that's gone. Now you don't know why you're there. So it was very depressing, I remember. And a lot of the philosophers that came along didn't really help very much. They made things worse. But Hegel was kind of a godsend for me, because Hegel came along and basically explained for me how things worked. And by the way, it's kind of the worldview, basically, that encapsulates all the other worldviews. So in a sense, it still does work, even though, of course, Hegel died in 1831. But nonetheless, his answers kind of form the framework for how you can then interpret everything else. So how does this work? Well, one way of looking at it is to refer to it as evolution. Now, he never called it that. He called it the German equivalent of becoming. So I think I've already mentioned that while up until Hegel and his generation, it was viewed from Descartes on that the universe was kind of a mechanistic universe, everything very mechanical, like a machine. But with Hegel and his contemporaries, it becomes organic. So the metaphor becomes that liberty tree, the idea of an oak tree, an acorn. At what point does an acorn become an oak tree, right? It's one of those philosophical questions you can't really decide. It's almost like one of the Greek paradoxes or antinomonies, where you have how many grains of sand does it take before you have a pile of sand, right? 5 grains? No, that's not a pile. That's a smidgen of sand. But at what point do you finally have a pile of sand? It's not like in the rule book. When you have 33.5 grains of sand, now you have a pile. It's just not the way that works. There's no clear. There's lots of things we have like that. Like, clearly there are races, and yet biologically there are not, right? So DNA, we check. There's one race, one human race, right? Not other races, and yet, depending on your culture, your country, you grow up learning to identify people as coming from different races or different classes, etc. And yet, when you try to figure out, well, who's in what race, etc., one of my neatest discoveries just the last couple of years, thanks to science and DNA, is that I'm part Neanderthal. 1-point-something percent, 1.2% something. I was hoping for 2-something percent, but I got 1.2%. That's that National Geographic DNA thing. You swab send it off, and then they send you back and say, aha, you're from 25,000 years ago, your ancestors were here and here, And
wouldn't that make everybody technically part Neanderthal? We all
no. No, Northern Europe, basically. In fact, if you're Caucasian, that's the easiest way to figure out that, because apparently, I mean, when I was a kid, we thought the Neanderthals looked kind of like apish, like the character in the Geico commercial, that's all upset because of the way they treat, cavemen, right? That was the way we thought. But, the latest latest DNA image of Neanderthal. This is the, so that's, so, and by the way, that does actually make sense when you look at Northern Europe, and you look where are the Caucasian peoples from, as the folks moved from Africa into Northern Europe, the more they merged into Northern Europe, the more Caucasian they became. But if they didn't go through Europe, and they didn't have a chance to mate, with the Neanderthals, then they don't pick up the Caucasian genes. But it's really quite interesting. There's all sorts of other, how you handle salt. It's different things. I'm not really into all of it, but so it's really quite changed a lot since when just years ago. Amazing DNA studies. Of course, we might eventually discover that this is all bonkers. I mean, that's like butter. Butter's good for you. Butter's bad for you. Butter's good for you. Butter's bad for you. Oh, butter's good for you. Eat more butter. No, it'll kill you. What? That's kind of the dialectical process all by itself. But so Hegel in fitting in with his contemporaries are, well, number one, they're responding to Kant. Remember, Kant sets the stage by pointing out that Hume is right, but we could still do metaphysics because if you're a rational person, you will view the world in these ways. You'll have space and time, you'll have quantity and quality, etc. So all the things can be handled through a metaphysics that Hume didn't expect, right? But at the same time, Kant still accepts the idea that we can't know the thing in itself as it is, nor can we know the id, the ego, right? You can't know that because it's not part of the phenomena, right? Well, Hegel's generation comes along and says, that's nonsense, Kant. How can you say that we can't know something that must be there, the thing in itself, or the ego? How can we not know that? Or even worse, the concept of God. Remember, they were studying to be theologians, seminary, right? And so, as a Christian, you're ordered to know God, especially as a Lutheran. Remember, Martin Luther's main rebellion was that you can't just be a lax Christian and let the priest do all the work for you. And I don't want to talk about them right now. Sorry about that. But you have to do the work yourself. You have to, read the Bible yourself, interpret your relationship with Jesus Christ yourself, right? You have to know God. And yet Kant's saying you can't know God, because God is outside of phenomena, right? He's got to be there as far as Kant's concerned. It's kind of an argument, the argument that without God, morality makes no sense. Because there has to be a highest value, right? Otherwise, what's the chain of value? It doesn't make sense, right? Without God, anything goes, right? Everything is permitted, says Nietzsche, right? Without God. But you have to believe in God if you're a Christian. And so the idea that Kant can say that there are things, the numinous, that have to be the case, but we can't know anything about them, seems just contradictory. And so Hegel and his contemporaries basically discover or realize that our concepts are part of our phenomena. Hume certainly talks about that, right? They're less lively phenomena, but nonetheless they're phenomena. Well, so our concepts are phenomena, and the concepts evolve too through this dialectical process. So this is an ancient Greek conception. It really comes from Heraclitus, at least, right? And that's essentially that you have a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you have this pattern, right? And all it really is the thesis is the current status quo or situation, right? And then out of that status quo comes some kind of conflict. And it doesn't seem to have to come from like an exterior thing. So it doesn't have to be like, well, there's Persia, and Persia all of a sudden has Greece, and Greece and Persia end up at war with one another. An external conflict. Doesn't have to be that way. It's even something simple like, you come in, you're tired from working, you sit down in a chair, and the chair is nice and comfortable, but after about 15 minutes maybe or so, now you don't feel comfortable in that chair. What the heck happened? It's still you, you're still your muscles, your shape, your chair, and all of a sudden now you're uncomfortable in that same chair. You're comfortable 1 minute and not comfortable the next. And so you have to get up or something, right? Right? There's a change, So out of the thesis and the antithesis, the uncomfortableness of the chair, comes a synthesis, the new situation. It changes, right? So it's just an explanation for how change takes place. Here's the situation. Oh, it doesn't stay that way, and now it's something different, right? And then it changes again, because the new synthesis, right, is the next thesis, right? And so the status changes again, and so on and so forth, right? Well, everything is that way, more or less, right? Including our concepts. So, for example, if I'm thinking about having a candy bar, did I talk about the candy bar already? No? I don't know why. I like the candy bar thing. It's pretty stupid, but say, there's a candy bar. It's a Snickers. Well, I'm going to have that Snickers. Then this little blue angel in my head says, but you're already too fat. That's bad for you. You're pre-diabetic, says the doctors now, because diabetes has changed, through the dialectical process. And now, even though I haven't really changed, now all of a sudden I'm pre-diabetic, which just means I get more medicine, which I don't know what it does. But, okay, so here's a candy bar. I shouldn't eat the dang thing, but I love Snickers candy bars, so I think I'll buy it and then eat it. But then the blue angel says, but you want to live forever so that you could get Social Security until, you guys are completely broke, right? Right? Plus my pension from the military, to the government. The government's just going to go bankrupt paying me, for my pensions and stuff, Yes. No, don't worry, it's not that much. But so this fight happens inside my head between my imagining myself eating a Snickers bar or not eating the Snickers bar. And, the red angel punches the blue angel in the head, and I go and I eat the Snickers bar. And then I feel bad, because now I'm picking up the blue angel and dusting the poor blue angel off, and I'm saying, but you were right, I shouldn't have eaten it, why did I do that, etc. So this dialectical process is a very real thing, even though it's just happening inside my head. These concepts are real, part of my phenomena. Right? And so when I'm having a conceptual argument with someone over the nature of God, for example, we're both having a real argument about a conceptual phenomena, right? So God in that sense is real, even though God exists in the mind of those who are arguing over God, right? And human beings have evolved themselves. They're in a state of becoming. And we could look at a particular human being and see precisely how this happens. We start off as infants. And the kinds of experiences or the conceptions we have are, well, there's a mother's face, a smiling face, there's a breast that maybe feeds us, etc., says Hegel, right? So we end up with these basic ideas as a child, right? But eventually we reach a stage where we hit the terrible twos and we learn what Hegel calls kind of to be imaginative, right? We can imagine the opposite. So we can say no. Somehow we end up learning to say no. For Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, this Hegelian leap will become being and nothingness, right? Which for Sartre, being a human being introduces nothingness into being through our ability to negate, to say no, right? But if you think about it, that's absolutely amazing. By the way, there's a new book by Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos. Where he argues that this is where the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, that everything is material, and everything can be explained from a scientific analysis of the way matter works, is stuck because of consciousness. When consciousness arrives, all of a sudden, materialistic theories just can't do it, can't explain it. And you get into all the attempts at how science is trying to explain consciousness, and it doesn't work. And so, as far as he's concerned, we have to go to some non-materialistic view of nature that incorporates something that allows consciousness to exist. That strikes me as part of the amazing arrival of that ability of a human being to say no, to imagine the opposite of whatever mom wants, or your dad wants, or, when does that happen? We call it the mirror effect, by the way, right? That's when you're able to see the mirror image of yourself and know that it's you. So, by the way, that also arguably doesn't mean just human beings are capable of this, right? In fact, the latest goofy thing I saw was a fish and mirror experiment. I guess that's it. I don't know if this is... Well, that's dumb.
My beta fish likes her view.
Pardon?
My beta fish likes her view.
Yeah, so here's, no, I don't want to sign up for nothing. This tiny fish can recognize itself in a mirror. Is it self-aware? So that's the question. Is that new? So February 7th, so that's not too many days ago. So this whole idea of the mirror effect, and consciousness, that's kind of, can you be self-aware? So actually at 2, it's not clear, says Hegel, that the child is self-aware. You become self-aware when one other stage is reached. And that's the section that we have in the text, which is absolutely famous. It's called the master-slave or master-servant section. It's from his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. But it's just a section of it. This is the section, the phenomenology of spirit is the study of the phenomena of consciousness, spirit, mind. So if you're discovering that, okay, so these concepts that we have are spirit. And remember, Berkeley talked about everything being spirit. So at this point, Hegel is an idealist of the same sort that Berkeley is. And notice it's important to not think that this is just some spiritual stuff. I would argue that it's energy. So what we're looking at is everything is energy in the contemporary sense, really. Now, they're obviously not thinking of it that way. This is pre-Einstein, obviously. But if you think of it as everything is energy instead of like some sort of solid matter that can't account for any of these kinds of characteristics of nature, right? But that includes our minds having these energy fields which we think of as concepts. They're very real to us. We experience them as phenomena, and they have a life. They're really there, and they're a very important part of what we're aware of, and they affect what we might think of as the material world and back and forth. I mean, your philosophical view of things is going to change your behavior. It could make you depressed, happy, right? Just ideas, of course. You could get happy over ideas and stuff, right? It's on sale, yay! I can go and get my favorite sweater for cheap, whatever, right? I remember when we would go to East Germany on a shopping trip when I was stationed in Berlin. It was kind of cool because with the way the economy was and with the way the Eastmark and the Westmark were, and we were allies, they couldn't check us for marks when we crossed the border. So we could change our Westmarks for Eastmarks in the west side and get them, usually it was 2.5 to 1, but the official exchange was 1 to 1, and we had already used $1 to buy our marks, so basically whenever we would go shopping in the East, we could buy something at 1/10 the actual cost. So we bought all kinds of weird things that we would never have bought. For example, Dresden crystal. It's just some of the world's best glass crystal. From Dresden. You'd never buy that. We still shouldn't have it. Actually, it's pretty dumb. Having especially we have earthquakes here. And we have it in a crowded cabinet of other East German things that are all breakable. Like my wife's favorite porcelain ballerina. Incredibly cheap. For what it is. Have we ever tried to sell it and make money off it? No, because she likes it too much, right? So we're never going to do that. But just the idea of how good a deal we were getting, right? Certainly has an impact on. So that's pretty obvious how real ideas can be for you. But at this point in the phenomenology, he goes from the infant to the toddler to the point where self-consciousness arrives in each of us, right? And here's his description of it, which a lot of people feel like this is incredibly difficult And I guess maybe it is. But if you see how he's working here, he's not writing philosophy like the way Immanuel Kant does, or Descartes, etc. This is instead kind of a story of how this works. So self-consciousness is in and for itself. So the in itself is the subjective side that's having the experience. And the for itself are the set of concepts that I think of as me, or myself in my current situation. Like right now I'm thinking of myself as sitting in a chair. That's an unusual, usually I just stand up for the whole lecture, but here I'm sitting down, right? So the for itself is this schema, conceptual schema that I'm thinking of me of as me and the situation, right? So self-consciousness is in and for itself, and through being in and for itself, for another self-consciousness, because you are all individual self-consciousnesses, and I'm aware of the fact that I'm being regarded, by the way, and that concept of le regard is really very important. It's identity politics. What Francis Fukuyama talks about today, so much of the problems that we're having, he identifies as identity politics. And what is that identity? It's le regard, how you look at me. Do you pay attention? Do you care about me? Are you ignoring my situation in Ohio, et cetera, right? So it's the importance of my being regarded by another self-consciousness. That is, it is only as something acknowledged or recognized. It doesn't exist unless someone else or myself recognize it. I exist for myself, and I exist for others, right? But think about what it's like if no one ever notices you, right? Wow, that's terrible, right? So it is only as something acknowledged or recognized. The concept of this unity, because even though it's the in itself and the for itself, those two together form the self, right? So this unity of self-consciousness in its duplication, because it's the two things, right, of the infinitude realizing itself in self-consciousness. Why infinitude? Because I can think about myself, thinking about myself, thinking about myself, thinking about myself, right? And by the way, that would be essentially one ingredient in understanding why someone can have multiple personalities, right? For example, right? 14 personalities. I hate you. I love you. And they all fight with one another inside. Why? Well, they're all different conceptual schemas that the individual has in their head. And they think, I'm this one. No, I'm this one. I can't get my head to turn around though and spit out green pea soup. Blah. Some of that is clearly visual special effects and not, So the concept of this unity of self-consciousness in its duplication of the infinitude, realizing itself in self-consciousness, right? It just can go on, is a many-sided and many-sensed complex, so that the moments of this complex must both be held. By the way, this is page 911, if you're looking. Sorry, I just assumed. If you have your text. I'm sure I could pull this up, or a variant of it, if you want to. At the same time, taken and understood in this differentiation as not distinct, or always also in their opposed sense. How do I interpret the self? Are these two sides of me distinct? Well, yes and no. They can be opposed, right? I'm never what I really think of as me, right? I'm faking it. I'm trying to pretend to be a teacher. In fact, I want to be the best teacher you've ever had. I'm not doing it. I'm not even close, I'm sure. You've had other great teachers that I'm depressed about that. I'm sad I'm not the best teacher, but I still want to try to be that, right? Wow. I was never a soldier. You guys are paying me my military retirement. I was officially in the military for 16 years, 9 months, and 3 days. And yet the whole time I was just pretending. I did my best not to laugh. All sorts of doofus things. Get down, soldier, and knock him out until I'm tired. Right? Do not laugh. It just makes it worse, right? So you pretend, right? You act the part, etc. But you're never that. You're never completely that role. You're always so much more than that, right? Just like Magnetron, or whatever his name is. Magneto. You're always more than that, says the professor, right? That's X-Men, right? Should I use X-Men as a... No, forget it. Okay. So, the double-sensedness of what is distinguished lies in the essence of self-consciousness. This interplay is the way self-consciousness is, right? Of being infinite or boundless. That is immediately the contrary of the determination in which it is established. The laying apart of the concept of the spiritual unity in its duplication presents to us the movement of acknowledging, right? There is for self-consciousness another self-consciousness. Picture this, 2 individuals maybe, right? It has come outside itself because while I'm meeting someone else, I'm trying to imagine what that person is thinking. So I'm outside of me trying to figure out what that self-consciousness is thinking. We all do this, right? In fact, if you're too autistic, that's the problem you have, is you're incapable of imagining that the other individual has intentions, right? The autistic person thinks of everyone as kind of like a machine, right? It's just doing stuff. Why did they do that? Why are they sticking their hand out like this? Oh, I should shake it. I've learned I should shake it. But why did they do that, right? So the autistic person has trouble with that, right? But I know, if you have normal empathy for the other people, you know why people are doing these various things. They're looking at the pizza and they're thinking, oh my God, look at that crust. Wow, can you imagine that double cheese? And then they go like this. I don't get that, but still, that's a commercial. On TV, it's a thing. It's kind of rectangular. It's against the wall in my house. And if you turn it on, weird things happen on the screen. My dog, the St. Bernard, she sits there. She loves the Minions. She just sits there watching the Minions. And she doesn't like bananas. Okay, sorry. Where was I? So there is for self-consciousness another self-consciousness. It has come outside itself. This has a twofold significance. First, self-consciousness has lost itself because I'm not thinking about me anymore. I'm no longer self-conscious. I'm wondering about that other person, right? For it finds itself as another being, right? Second, it has thereby done away with the other, for it does not see the other either as the essential being, but it itself in the other. So when I'm trying to imagine what you're thinking, if I'm thinking that I understand what you're thinking, I'm actually lying to myself because I don't know what the hell you're thinking. Only you really know that. And in fact, I would only really know what I'm thinking. But I've exited myself, and now I'm imagining that I can know what you're thinking, right? Self-consciousness must do away with this otherness it has. Now, this is kind of fairy tale-ish, I think. This is the doing away with of the first double sense, and hence itself a second double sense. First, it must set out to do away with the other independent being in order thereby to become certain of itself as the essential being. Second, in so doing, it sets out to do away with itself, for this other being is itself. So I'm trying to kind of really I want you to think a certain way. I'm all wrapped up in how you're thinking, and so I'm no longer my self-consciousness, nor am I really observing yourself. This is, of course, the typical person that doesn't listen to the other person, doesn't let the other person express what they want, but instead I'm telling you what you're thinking. You want to go to this. You want to study clarinet. No, I want to study flute. No, you want the clarinet because the line is shorter. That's how I got into clarinet, by the way. I wanted flute. This double-sensed doing away with its double-sensed otherness is equally a double-sensed return into itself. For first, through doing away, it gets itself back, for it becomes once more equal to itself through doing away with its otherness. Second, however, it no less gives back the other self-consciousness to the latter again, for it had etc. You get the idea. So I can just picture myself going into the bar, and man, it's kind of embarrassing. I'm so short. Those round stools at the bar, they're always just too tall, so I have to one cheek it, to try, because, if you just sit on top of the stool, your feet are sitting there, and you look like a little kid, right? And that's the truth, right? And if you don't sit on the stool, you're not like really even there, right? So you just put, the one cheek on, and you get your foot on the floor, and you're kind of just sitting there like that, right? And you've got your 10-gallon hat and stuff. And in comes the beautiful cowgirl, etc. And, she walks like your baby here, how they do, right? And you want to say hello, right? And you're thinking, what does she think of me, right? Does she think I'm handsome? No, she probably sees right through me and knows that I'm an idiot, right? But you want to act like you don't think she thinks you're an idiot, right? So you say hello in kind of a suave, debonair kind of, way, right? And, of course, she really does think you're an idiot, but at the moment there's no one else there, right? And so she says hello. She figures she'll just walk away. You can picture this. You can play this out. All the back and forth and all the thinking about what she's thinking and what she's thinking that I'm thinking. I'm trying to figure out what she's thinking that I'm thinking, right? That's just incredible how you could play this out in so many different ways, etc. Well, so the movement of self-consciousness in its relation to another self-consciousness has been presented in this way now as the doing of the one. But this doing of the one has itself the twofold significance of being as much its doing as the doing of the other. For the other is no less independent, shut up within itself, and there is nothing in it that is not owing to itself. The first self-consciousness does not have the object before it, as the latter to begin with is merely for desire, but an independent object existing for itself, over which, therefore, it has of itself no power, unless the object does with itself what self-consciousness does with it. The movement is thus, in all respects, the double movement of both self-consciousnesses. Each sees the other one do the same as it does. Each does itself what it demands of the other, and so does what it does, only inasmuch as the other does the same. A one-sided doing would be unavailing, because what is intended should occur can come about only through both. The doing is therefore double-sensed, not only inasmuch as it is a doing as much to itself as to the other, but also inasmuch as it is undividedly as much the doing of the one as of the other, etc. So this continues on. And he goes on to analyze how one self-consciousness tends to dominate the other. And that's where like my blue angel and red angel come into play, because this actually can happen just inside your own head. It can happen between one or two people, of course, right? It could happen in a group, right? Where you're trying to persuade the group to do something, right? Let's win one for the Gipper, go out and, push them back, way back, right? All that stuff, right? Or it could be groups dialoguing with other groups. In a sense, we have individuals that might represent those. So I'm imagining that President Trump and Kim crazy-haired, North Korean type person are dialoguing today. And of course, what they're trying to do is set things up for some sort of reconciliation, all that stuff, right? And Trump is not just himself. He's representing the United States, whether you are thrilled that he is or not. And Kim, of course, whether any of his North Koreans realize it or not, can clearly have a tremendous impact on all of North Korea, etc. Plus, Vietnam is having a ball because they're the center of attention of all of this, right? Plus, they've already been held up as, here's an example for you guys, right? North Korea, you could look like Vietnam if you explore all these open possibilities, right? And so on. So all these consciousnesses, which are not just one single individual, but groups, are all having this effect. The legislature, right? Not only the one today in D.C. that's voting to deny the emergency that Trump has declared, but also the ones that we've got in Juneau that are representing us, right? We've been dialoguing with, just this last weekend, a lot of people attended the sessions with their representatives and had a chance to say what they thought about the budget, etc. No, you could tax everybody else, but keep my income fine, how everybody says, right? And of course, our representatives are now hashing out all of this stuff. That's consciousness, self-consciousness at a higher and higher complex level. And we represent what? All of Alaska, all of the United States, all of the world. And as far as Hegel's concerned, when you're thinking about all of the world at the moment, that's your Weltgeist. That's the world soul at the moment, which you could also call the Zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the times, right? And that's, that's a real thing. It's consciousness. It's all these ideas in people's minds, but nonetheless, it's a real thing, right? And so we have a world soul. It's kind of interesting. Remember when he saw Napoleon riding through Jena on a white horse, Hegel said, there goes the world soul on a white horse. Because at that moment, Napoleon represented the farthest point in the development of human freedom, as far as Hegel was concerned, right? Political freedom, representing the French revolution, which had then turned into Napoleon, and Napoleon was changing Europe, establishing the Napoleonic Code, which is still tremendously influential in Europe. And there goes that conscious, self-conscious entity that knows it is the spirit of the times, changing the way things are, right? So this is the study of the phenomena of culture or spirit, right? That he's trying to do, right? And God is the way humans think about God and has evolved over history. So it's not a surprise that Hegel does a history of philosophy to study how this human thinking has evolved through philosophy. But he's also done a philosophy of history, where he analyzes why studying history is so important. Because if we don't understand the history, we don't understand the development, we don't understand how this happened or why people think the way they do. So he changed the way history is studied, and that's essentially the evolution of human culture or sociology. So I connect Hegel with the development of sociology. In fact, if we think of one of the Greek books on the phenomenology itself, it's Stephen Pinkard, The Sociality of Reason. Does this all make sense? Does it seem like Hegel's really that difficult? I think if I remember hearing one philosopher who was up to Alaska from California, gave a lecture at APU one evening, and she said, everything made sense up to Kant, and then after that, nothing really was important. And I was like, what? What about Hegel? And she looked, because I asked her that question in a big, that big auditorium. And she looked at me and she said, something happened there and I don't understand what it was. I'm like, wow, that is a cop-out. Thank goodness UAA has loads of professors that talk about Hegel and don't get lost at Kant, But basically what that meant was she went into the analytic tradition and never got out, right? That's a very important, tradition. It's important to study the nature of language, to see how meaning works, etc. That's what that tradition does. But you shouldn't give up on the big picture stuff. That continues on, and we're still seeing lots of stuff happen in the big picture. And I lucked out. I had a professor who was originally from Lithuania, Dr. Stanley Rajukis. He became a monk, went to Poland to study in seminary. After he graduated there, he went to Germany to study for his graduate work. When Hitler took over, he fled to Switzerland. And I remember in class him complaining that he should have stayed in Germany because the Germans were ready for prisoners, but the Swiss weren't ready for refugees. But then after the war, he went to the United States, got his PhD at NYU, then married a librarian from Maryland, and eventually ended up teaching at my alma mater because it was a state school and they had great pensions. But I got to listen to him, and he taught 19th century thought, and he knew the Europeans incredibly well. I lucked out because I had a professor that was familiar with the tradition. I think that really made a big difference in the United States because I never turned. Did you need the mic? Is the mic? I guess I should have. Did you need that? I can start all over again if you want. Back to consciousness. Isn't that fun? I like that stuff. But that's a whole different way of reading as you're reading that. And notice it's ambiguous, and there's all sorts of articles of books about what the heck's going on here, because Some folks feel like it's just talking about two individuals well, not in a bar necessarily, but it's kind of famous this way because the one is the master and has power over the other consciousness, but eventually that other consciousness, the servant, ends up doing all the things that the master wants, so that the master's self-conception of himself becomes totally dependent on the servant, and you're hopeless without the servant. You can't do anything without the servant. So in a sense, the servant becomes the master, right? So it's ironic, how the piece works out. So in that sense, it's considered great literature, not just philosophy, right? But it doesn't have to be between two individuals. Notice you can think of it as within your one consciousness is how you normally will dialogue with yourself over what you should do. Should I get up? Or it could be, between groups, as I mentioned. It could be between an individual and a group, right? So at all these different levels of consciousness, you could see this happening. Plus, you could think of it as through the competition between various ethnic groups and cultures. Like the war or the conflict, between the West and the East, or Islam and France, or so you could see those and interpret those that way. The book I mentioned by Fukuyama is right here. And in fact, we can listen. Is that just this video is screwed up? Fine.
5,000 years of Chinese music and dance in one night.
Said we don't want to live in this kleptocratic regime of Viktor Yanukovych that's being dragged into the orbit of Vladimir Putin. We want to be Europeans that have an impersonal modern government that respects its citizens, where you don't have to be an insider to get ahead. So this demand for respect, lies at the core of democracy. Democracies give us respect by giving us rights. We have the right to speech, to associate, to have religious beliefs, and ultimately to participate in politics through voting. That's the way that they treat us as adults that are capable of governing ourselves. At least that's the theory that underlies democracy. An authoritarian regime treats you at best like a child, if you're in Singapore, and at worst as some kind of human trash that the regime can use for its own purposes. So, it's a foundation of democracy. The trouble is that many people are not satisfied by that. They want other forms of recognition that link them to other people, to communities, particularly when those communities have been marginalized. And the first manifestation of this kind of collective identity, was nationalism, which, from the French Revolution, you had both the rights of man, which was the liberal, individualistic version of recognition, but you also had the rise of nationalism, which then goes on to consume the rest of Europe, as all of these countries that are living inside dynastic empires say, no, we Serbs we don't have our own country. We're not being recognized as an independent people. And then, they push for independence, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls apart under these kinds of pressures, and so forth. And so the legitimate demand for equal recognition in the case of nationalism evolves very quickly into an aggressive demand to be better than other people, to dominate your neighbors, and that's what brings us the terrible world wars of the early 20th century. I think a lot of Islamism is also identity-based. A lot of these young guys that go, and grow long beards and take an AK-47 up in Syria. A lot of them are European Muslims who don't feel comfortable with their traditional cultural values, but they also don't feel like they've been accepted in France or in the Netherlands or whatever European society they're living in. And what the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, any of these groups does, is it says, I'll tell you who you are. You're a Muslim, you're part of this great ummah that extends all the way around the world. Muslims are being disrespected, killed, suppressed, and you have the agency to do something about that. So come join our movement. And so it's more that sense of identity and belonging rather than true piety that I think drives a lot of people to become extremists. Now, there's a form of this that has developed in the United States and in Europe and in other developed democracies that is part of our liberalism or grew out of our liberalism, but it's evolved in a certain way that I think challenges liberalism in a number of ways. The social movements, these very important social movements that began in the 1960s with the civil rights movement for African Americans, with the feminist movement, with the LGBT movement, movements for the disabled, Native Americans, so on and so forth. All of these groups had been disrespected. They were disregarded, not recognized as having equal dignity by mainstream American society. White male, Anglo-Protestant dominant elites in the country. And so what they wanted was recognition and also some substantive redress of their socio-economic position. And that was a very just and important movement. As time went on, the left began to change its composition and its tactics because the left in the United States had been built around the working class. The majority of whom were white. I mean, in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal, that was the biggest part of the New Deal coalition.
So that's a little of Fukuyama's latest book, his book tour. That's a DC bookstore, by the way, in the neighborhood where he used to live when he was in the Reagan administration. Or actually, I guess he was in the Rand Corporation, but they were helping with the Reagan administration. But his books have all used Hegel as a basic philosophical point of view. For example, his very first book that made him famous was The End of History and the Last Man. And that's a play actually on part of Hegel's philosophy. The end of history is the goal that history seems to have. So it's not like history's over. It's the end in the sense of what's the aim of all of this evolutionary process that's going on in history. And Hegel argues that it's human freedom. And in his philosophy of history, he analyzes what he knew of history, and granted, we could look back and say that, wow, he didn't really know that much about history compared to what we know today. Like, for example, Africa. He didn't know diddly squat about Africa, because there wasn't that much known. And so as far as he could tell, there was no culture in Africa. And so he famously referred to Africa as the dark continent because it wasn't enlightened, right? Europe was enlightened, but Africa was dark, right? So it's the dark continent. Pretty dumb, especially in light of all of the things we know today. But in any case, in analyzing these various historical periods, he determines how much freedom individuals had in that particular culture, and he concludes that the individual individual amount of freedom, in various cultures would gradually evolve from one culture to the next, so that, in the one culture, the Chinese culture, only the emperor had freedom. In the Roman Empire, the Senate had freedom, but no one else, right? As time evolves, he says that thanks to the arrival of Jesus, you end up with everyone having an opportunity, at least some, having the opportunity to know God, right? But it's not until the Protestant Reformation that you end up then with everyone having the opportunity to know God, right? So for Hegel, Protestantism is an advance, an evolutionary advance over Catholicism. By the way, Fukuyama, in his, let's see which one, political order and political decay, and the origins of political order, when he's analyzing this evolution of culture and political order, he points out that all of the capitalistic societies were Protestant. And still today, when you look at the places where Catholicism still is dominant, like southern Italy, it's kind of remarkable. If you look at Italy, northern Italy is very much like Germany, very industrious, very capitalistic, very individualistic. The conception that individuals have of themselves is that modern self there. But if you go into southern Italy and Sicily, those are still Catholics, and they're still dominated by the authorities, and they don't think for themselves, nor have they gotten into enterprises. So they're not into business. As a result, the economy in southern Italy and Sicily is a drag on all of Italy, right? So the real problem economically is there, right? And Spain is also a problem like that. Greece was still Orthodox, right? But when you look at where the Protestant ethic has had its impact, you've got a lot more industry, and the individuals feel much more modern, right? And of course there's the movement towards atheism. In a sense, the end result of the Protestant Reformation is atheism. So, because as you move with Martin Luther away from Catholicism, instead of accepting the authority and instead decide that I should interpret Scripture for myself and know what Jesus means to me, the end result of everyone doing that is that no one's going to believe anyone else. And the end result of that then is atheism. So the modern self comes out of that. Is this fun? Find this interesting? Is it mind-blowing if you've never thought about things this way? I remember it being absolutely mind-blowing to me. One of the things that helped was at the time that I was studying with Dr. Rayukas and learning about Hegel, I was also taking Introduction to Sociology. And that's where I learned about Peter Berger and the social construction of reality, which turned out to be very Hegelian, obviously, right? And very clear. So while reading Hegel might have taken the benefit of having someone like Dr. Rayukas to teach us, so that we didn't become confused like some university professors from California that don't understand what the heck is going on with Hegel. And by the way, a big problem we have with European thinking, the analytic tradition in the United States and England likes to make things very clear. It wants want the meaning defined very precisely, logically, so that basically you could write computer code with it, and the computer's not going to be confused. What do you mean by "and" in this case, right? You know, the computer's not going to do that. But when you're listening to European thinkers today, they say things and then they say just the opposite, and they don't think that that's a problem, right? They'll talk in what seems to be riddles, and a lot of contemporary Americans, for example, Alan Sokal, the Sokal affair. So they look at some of the European postmodernist speak and are convinced that it's just total nonsense. And in fact, you know, that was kind of a famous controversy that's still, you know, going on, really. What's crazy about this is Alan Sokal used a computer algorithm to write an essay, which was actually, so it was computer generated, total nonsense, right, based on the postmodern jargon of a particular journal. He sent it into that journal, and they accepted it and published it. And at the same time that happened, he published an article in a science journal explaining what he did to that magazine. So all the scientists were going, "Yay, see, you guys are talking nonsense." But meanwhile, by the way, the postmodernists looked at the article and said, "But we like the article. What the heck," right? The real fun thing, in my point of view, though, was that several MIT students took his algorithm and plugged it into a database of science jargon and submitted an article that they created with it to a science journal, and the science journal accepted the article. But then they pointed out what they had done, and the science journal said, "Oh, well, we're not going to publish that then." But so then it went through a back and forth kind of thing until they ended up publishing an article about the article that they would have published had, et cetera, right? So it got published. But what becomes obvious here is that if you take the vocabulary and you use an algorithm, you can mix it up. Did I show you in my where is it here? Didn't I show you this one? Right? And one of the things in this is the postmodern generator here, which is here. So this uses that algorithm that's so-called. It's now called the Dada engine, and so this is apparently an essay, right? You know, that you know, it's generated by the computer. It's not a person-written essay, right? And remember, if you just click refresh, you get a totally different, that fast, right? Because it's just a computer-generated essay. In the works of Stone, a predominant concept is the concept of sub-capitalist reality. It's, right, you know, so, but that's just the way a lot of postmodern journals, you know, how the articles go, right? But the thing is, if MIT students can do the same thing to a science article, it makes it look like all that we're really doing. And what you're really getting out of college is you're embedding that algorithm properly in your head, so you know how to go and research a database, and then you can write using that algorithm and give. So if you get an employer that hires you to write an article about the expectation of oil production this month, you know exactly how to do the research, and you've got the algorithm, you put it together, and you've published your article, right? yes, eventually computers will be able to do that for you. So that's another modus vivendi for AI to take over human jobs and leave us without anything to earn money, right? So that's scary. But the social construction of reality was a beautiful description. That looks like a book. It is a book, but it was, I think, only 198 pages or so. So very short. 240. Of course, there's an index, but you get the idea. This is a nice abbreviated explanation of how this dialectical process works and it's sociology. So Hegel's philosophy, in a sense, has become what sociology does. And now think about some of these problems, because once you do that, what's true? Right? There's a couple things we can say right away. Okay, so empirically, this is a bottle, with water in it, by the way, and we could empirically verify that. So that's easy, right? And I can talk about 2 + 2 = 4. That's easy, right? We have no problem with that. But when you get right down to it, the reason we have no problem with that is because we're all on the same page. We're all fluent speakers of this language, and we would agree, right? But when we talk about things like values and astronomy, as I mentioned, how things have changed over time, what's true has evolved in the same way that our consciousness has evolved, right? And so what's true for example, is it okay to say that slavery is okay? No. There's absolutely no way we would agree with slavery as being a proper business today. And yet, of course, it wasn't that long ago that it certainly was, right? So what people really thought was true, certainly there would be people that would disagree, especially in Boston, maybe, right? But nonetheless, most people believed in slavery. As most cultures, I think, today still do. I don't know how you would measure that, right? But clearly, morality has progressed. And so what we think is true has progressed, right? As we argue today over whether or not people have the right to health care, right? That's totally new. Jefferson had no concept of health care back in the day, right? And so when they wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident to who? Not to King George, by the way, right? But to themselves. They were arguing that all men are created equal. That's still not self-evident, depending on what you're talking about. And what's the modern self? When I talked about, I think, Descartes, we talked about the modern self a little bit. Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self, gives us this incremental evolution of the way these concepts in our minds that we use to think about who we are, what we are, what our existence means to us, has incrementally evolved, and you can follow the course of this evolution through the literature. So in this book, he goes all the way back to Plato, but moves forward all the way up to the making of modern identity. Right? And his follow-up book, which won the Templeton Award is the secular age. He talks about now. Notice there's a lot of folks that talk about that. So these are people that are influenced by Hegel's philosophy, understood the way Hegel's philosophy works, right? They're not confused the way that one professor was, right? By the way, Brian McGee talks about this in his book. Which is astoundingly interesting. This one. This is basically his autobiography of his own experience as a philosophy major in Cambridge or Oxford. I always get those two mixed up. But he was very disappointed in his experience in the university in Cambridge, because the reason he became a philosophy major in school was because he had all of these big questions in his mind. And he wanted to go to university to study philosophy so he could get answers to these questions. What he discovered at the university there was that no one there was interested in the big questions. They were all doing analytic philosophy. He was very frustrated that they weren't interested at all. As far as they were concerned, what he was asking were meaningless questions. There's no meaning to it, because you can't find out whether they're true or false. But that's exactly what he was interested in. It wasn't until after he left there and went to graduate school at Yale when he discovered that Yale was full of people interested in the big questions. So he learned what he really wanted about philosophy at Yale. So he's quite interesting that way. So this dichotomy between the analytic philosophers and the post-Hegelians, the Europeans, which are confusing because they love saying just the opposite. They could say it is and it isn't. And they don't feel that that's doublespeak, because they realize that there are lots of different contexts and things mean different things under different contexts. So just the way Hegel was talking there, with this double, interplay between, the consciousnesses, that's the way Europeans are today. So unless you get into that way of speaking in philosophy, you're not going to be able to follow what's going on in Europe. Okay. So let me give you a quick quiz question here, so you can head out. How many of you are planning on going to the lecture Thursday night? How many of you even know what the lecture is? Okay, so anyway, I suppose the easiest way I could go is to the poster that Sean posted, right? If I can get into Facebook.
Well, it's just not me, it's also John Mason. John Mason.
Are you Sean this way, right? Not
Yeah.
SH. Do you mind me showing people your... What is that? Was that your dinner?
That was my breakfast.
Your breakfast. Well, thank you. I love seeing what you eat. That's great. I'm torturing Sean. Sean likes posting pictures of philosophy books. Oh, that looks good. Oh, that doesn't.
Well,
But that is the poster. That's the one that I wanted to pull
That's
up.
the one?
So that's
Because there's another one where it shows.
the name of the philosopher. So this is Thursday evening at, 7 p.m. in the library, room
307.
whatever. Yeah.
Hanson.
Is that gonna- no,
It's
that's
the
not-
third floor conference. There's another photo.
I'm going the wrong way. Pardon?
Which library?
The consortium.
Yeah,
I don't know where.
there it is.
There it is. Okay. So the problem of God and evil from Plato to Paul to Pinker. I asked you about Steven Pinker the other day, and I think you all, I forget, was that in this classroom? No one recognized Steven Pinker? It's Thursday, the 28th, so this Thursday, from 7 to 9, and it's Dr. Eric Hall from Carroll College.
So there's this, and then there's the conference speakers next week too.
Yeah, Friday will be the student papers and discussions, so hopefully you'll be able to participate in some of that. Be a lot of debaters there, I think,
I know John makes these like.
or there
types
should
of
be. Encourage them to go if you get the chance. But so my question was, are you going? Just for fun. That's a really rotten question, isn't it?
It's
You don't
so
have to
late,
think,
though.
you can just write yes or
It's al-
no.
It's always been, the last one they did was the same time too.
I know, they should make it earlier. That should be the real question, should they make it earlier?
Should they make it what?
Earlier,
Hey, you can always
Of
talk
this earlier?
yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard time for me too. I'd probably sleep through it. I'll be there, but I'll
You
sleep.
can always talk to John Mason about that, you know.
Yeah,
He's their club president of Boston.
yeah. I'm just too old, that's the trouble. I need a nap. So see you Thursday.